Hi, and thank you for joining me for another lecture. And friends, today I want to discuss and explore a very interesting topic. Today we're going to discuss electric light bulbs on Hagim, which, as you know, also includes Shabbat. And friends, with all the controversy surrounding the release of the kosher switch, I felt that I should help clear up some issues for those really interested in knowing. And I must say that given all the attacks lunged at the kosher switch by Poskim, who initially endorsed it, shows that not only is courage lacking from our Torah leaders today, but honesty as well. Because unfortunately today, it's not about what's allowed or not, but rather a totalitarian streak that these rabbis never fail to employ. And the same really can be seen in the kosher industry, that the question is no longer is this or that kosher, but what do specific rabbis recommend? And this is yet another reason why people do not take orthodoxy or Orthodox rabbis seriously anymore. But the truth is that Judaism, as it exists today, is the religion whose practitioners know the least of how their religion functions. And this is mainly due to the thought police that exists within it. Now, this lecture has nothing to do with a kosher switch, although I believe that it is 100% permissible to use. But rather, today I'm going to explain how it is just as permissible to use a regular switch to turn on an incandescent light bulb on Yom Tov, and I'm going to explain why. And friends, if you think this sounds radical, what if I told you that until around the 1930s, the norm actually was to turn electric lights on and off on Shabbat in the Orthodox world? Would you believe me? Actually, it wasn't until a small group of rabbis led primarily by the Chazon Ish who began a crusade to forbid the use of electricity at all costs. And if you know the way practices spread in the Orthodox world, it only really takes one ideologue to challenge modernity for everyone else to follow with the absurdity. Mainly because the primitive has come to mean the more religious. And for all those who are not interested in what can be proven and rather just have the names of rabbis that endorse the use of electricity, here's some prominent names for you, like Rabbi Yosef Meshash, Rabbi David HaKohen Scully, the Rishon LeZion Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, Rabbi Raphael Aharon Ben Shimon, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Toledano. Chief rabbis of Yerushalayim, Rabbi Svi Pesach Frank and Rabbi Shalom Meshash, Rabbi Masud HaKohen, Rabbi Yechiel Michael Alevi Epstein, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, the chief rabbi of Netanya, Rabbi David Selosh, the Tzitz Eliezer, who was the greatest posek in electrical devices for the last 100 years, right? Rabbi Eliezer Wallenberg. Also, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Strasberg, Rabbi Benjamin Aryeh Cohen Weiss, Rabbi Reuben Margolit, Rabbi Shraga Feivel Frank, and Rabbi Yehuda Yudiel Rosenberg. And suddenly today, the average Jew will flat out condemn anyone who uses lights on Shabbat as if they are actually violating Shabbat. Look, it's fine for you to do what you want, but it's also not fine for you to condemn someone if they're not breaking any melacha or any shvut. But regardless, friends, today we're going to discuss the reason this small handful of rabbis rose up against electricity. And we're also going to go through the reasons they gave and in turn show the other reasons that the other authorities gave to allow it. So, to begin, the reason given for prohibiting electricity are, first, mavid, kindling, that turning on a light is akin to kindling a fire. Two, makebe patish, that the completion of a circuit is in some way prohibited on the Sabbath. 3, cooking, bishul, that the heating up of a light bulb or a filament is equivalent to cooking. And 4, molid, because it's creating something new. Well, friends, like we do with any topic we explore today, friends, is no different, because we at Dor De'ah do not tell you what to think, but we help you learn how to think halachically. And before anything, friends, I'm going to simplify your life, because I'm sure that anytime you have ever bothered to learn this subject, you were so bombarded by many sources that build a straw man argument regarding the consequences for the manipulation of fire, as to in some way try to explain electricity. And halfway through any of these explanations, you give up. Because ultimately, who cares if something is just rabbinically prohibited or prohibited from the Torah? Because it's still prohibited either way. In other words, a rabbinic prohibition, lechatila, has to still be kept, just like a Torah command has to be kept, right? Lo tasur. When long story short, electricity is not in any way fire to begin with. So all these arguments are really non sequiturs. And I'm not in any way trying to justify the use of incandescent bulbs on Shabbat solely on the basis of electricity not being fire. But this is definitely where we must begin. So to really begin, we first have to define these terms. What is electricity and what is fire? Friends, electricity is the transfer of electrons along a wire, while fire is the reaction of a substance with oxygen. Now, again, we are working on building a premise before we can begin to understand the ins and outs of the issue without an actual Sanhedrin, which would honestly be the only way issues like this could be put to rest once and for all. But because electricity was not in any way understood or included in the court's shvutim, no such prohibition exists that we ourselves can directly link to an actual melacha. So to get started, let's begin at the source of this topic by first exploring the sugya that most use when trying to describe incandescent bulbs. So the topic of the incandescent bulbs surrounds the filament. Now, a filament is a conducting wire or thread within a light bulb that lights up when a current passes through it. Now, as you know, that incandescent bulbs are a sealed vacuum lacking the main component needed for fire to burn, which is what? Which is oxygen. So off the bat, it's a little difficult for anyone to claim that at least within its properties that electricity is in some way synonymous with fire. Now, the root of this prohibition is found in the Mishnah, which appears in Shabbat 41a. It rules, Amacham shepianu lo yiten letocho sonem bishvil sheyechamu aval noten hu letocho o letoch akos kedei lehavsheran. One who heats a metal pot, literally a boiler, may not pour cold water into it to heat it. However, one may pour water into the pot or a cup in order to temper it. Now, the Rambam explains this prohibition in two places. In Hilchot Shabbat, chapter 12, halacha 1, where he states, Amechamem et abarzol kedei lasorfo b'mayim, arai ze toledet maveir vechayav. A person who heats iron with fire in order to strengthen it by submerging it in water is liable for performing a derivative of forbidden labor, of mavid, of lighting a fire. So, again, here he says it's prohibited because of mavid, because of kindling a fire. The next place is Hilchot Shabbat, chapter 9, halacha 6, which states, Amatich echad mimine matechot kolshehu או המחמם את המתכת עד שתעשה גחלת. הרי זה תולדת מבשל. כללו של הדבר, בין שריפה גוף קשה באש, או שהקשה גוף רך. הרי זה חייב משום מבשל. A person who melts even the slightest amount of metal or heats a piece of metal until it glows like a coal performs a derivative of the forbidden labor of cooking. Similarly, a person who melts wax, tallow, tar, brown tar, or pitch, and the like performs a derivative of the forbidden labor of cooking and is liable. Similarly, a person who heats an earthenware utensil until it becomes hard clay is liable for cooking. The general principle is whether one softens a firm entity with fire or a soft entity, again with fire, one is liable for cooking, bishul. So here we see that he mentions that this prohibition is lumped in with the prohibition of bishul, of cooking, and we see that it's cooking only with actual fire. Now, what other example do we have that bishul, that cooking itself, in this case of the filament, is not connected with the biblical prohibition of cooking unless it's done with actual fire? Well, Hilchot Shabbat, chapter 9, verse 3. V'chen hamevashel bechamei teveria v'chayotze ba'em patur. It states, a person who cooks using the hot springs of Tiberia and the like is not held liable. Now, the not liable here is patur valasur, which still means that the act is prohibited, but only that it was later prohibited by the sages. In other words, our sages chose to extend the prohibition of cooking to include cooking with the hot waters of Tiberia as a shvut, because clearly it was only cooking with fire which was biblically forbidden, right, as a melacha, and not the plain act of cooking, in our case, heating a filament with a current. Are we clear so far? I know this is a lot of information, but if you get stuck, you could just replay portions of this lecture. And friends, I can't remind you enough that the attitude that the Jewish world has taken, and this even goes for the Sephardi Jewish world today regarding electricity, is really built solely on the opinions of the Chazon Ish, whose goal, as explained by one of his students, was to forbid the use of electricity across the board, sources or not. Now, this is not the way we confront halachic issues, at least without tarnishing the respect the public should have and has towards modern-day poskim. Actually, the statement of the Chazon Ish regarding his crusade against electricity, as quoted by one of his students, was that it's no chidush to say that it's mutar, but the chidush is to find out how it's asur, meaning the use of electricity. Now, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach vehemently disagreed and destroyed every one of the Chazon Ish's objections to electricity, giving him the great notoriety that he still holds today. But regardless, the Chazon Ish is not any less popular today than Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is. As a matter of fact, it is the Chazon Ish's arguments, again, against electricity that are taught as the authoritative din in all yeshivot. And even though, as we will go through these arguments, we'll see that the majority of poskim actually sided with Rav Shlomo Zalman on every one of these arguments. But regardless, the most famous reason the Chazon Ish used to prohibit the use of electricity in Shabbat was boneh. He stated that the completion of a circuit constitutes the tolda of building of boneh on Shabbat. He argues that completing a circuit renders a previously useless wire into a functional wire, and this is in some way analogous to someone building a house. Now, one of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's arguments defeating this position is that if one opens a circuit which is designed to be opened and closed routinely, it cannot be considered an act of building or destroying, mainly because closing a circuit is analogous to closing a door or a window or even a faucet. Actions that we don't have to tell you that the halakha does not consider to be building. Again, because all these objects were made to be constantly opened and closed. And friends, this is what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It's not my opinion. Actually, this is how the majority of poskim held regarding the turning on of electrical switches, that it was in no way considered boneh. However, another area also argued by the Chazon Ish is that electricity would be prohibited because turning on a switch is makebe patish, the final blow of the hammer, which generally is understood to mean the final act in finishing something and making it useful. He argued that since an electrical appliance is useless before electricity is added to it, by introducing an electrical current, right, it causes it to become a useful piece of equipment, and this therefore is prohibited because of makebe patish. However, Rav Shlomo Zalman again argues that since an appliance is designed to be frequently turned on and off, that action cannot be categorized as makebe patish or befatish, which again refers to some permanent act that involves great effort. So since one does not ordinarily intend to turn on an appliance permanently, and since turning on an appliance does not involve great effort, this action cannot be considered violating makebe patish. And friends, it's funny how there are so many against the use of electricity on Shabbat, and they don't even know why. And the ones who think they know will usually state something like the ambiguous Ruach Shabbat, right? The old, it's not according to the spirit of Shabbat, or it's not Shabbistic, right? In other words, that means something different for each individual. Another is Uvda Decho, a weekday activity, or Ziluta de Shabbat, a denigration of Shabbat. But friend, by saying all this, all they're really saying is that it's really not a sore, but just a whitewashed form of yeshivish lingo that they use not to hurt their shidduch prospects. But the truth is that there's always going to be individuals trying to tell others how to properly keep Shabbat. Not because what you're doing is against halakha, but just because they don't like it. Actually, this is why we have the practice of kindling Shabbat lights. Because some dorks were telling us that the true spirit of Shabbat was to sit in the dark. Or why we have the practice of eating chamim on Shabbat, because some dorks were telling us that our meals on Shabbat are meant to be cold. But anyways, the last example I'm going to bring down on why some say that electricity is forbidden on Shabbat is because of molid, or making something new. They teach that when a live circuit is closed and electrical current is caused to flow into the appliance, this action could be compared to a case in which a cup of perfume is spilled onto a piece of fabric in order to infuse it with fragrance. Friends, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rabbi Eliezer Wallenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, rebutted this argument, stating that any creative act which is routinely done and undone throughout the day cannot be included in the rabbinic prohibition of molid, of creating something new. And also that there are many examples in Shas of new creations that were not prohibited by the sages. So only because creating a new fragrance is prohibited does not mean that all new creation is prohibited on Shabbat. And Rav Shlomo Zalman also insists that only a limited number of actions were prohibited in the Talmud because of molid, and one may not learn from these limited examples that creating anything else new, like an electrical circuit, is rabbinically prohibited. Friends, and again, this is not my opinion. This is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and the Tzitz Eliezer. Friends, like I told you earlier, this topic of electricity and Shabbat is a deep, deep one, and today I barely just covered incandescent light bulbs, but the majority of these objections wouldn't even exist with other types of bulbs like LED lights that for sure no one today should have a problem with, but they still do. But anyways, friends, I hope I helped clear up the issue at least a little bit. For more information, friends, on everything Jewish, please visit bejewish.org. Thank you.